Microsoft Visual InterDev. What? The year was 1997. If you were a developer back then, chances are your desk was buried under ring binders full of MSD and CDS, your computer tower hummed like a lawnmower, and the internet still screeched its way into your life via a 56K modem. The web was young, clunky, and strangely optimistic. Most websites were static affairs, corporate brochures with clashing colors, marquee text, and the occasional animated GIF if the designer was feeling particularly daring. Into this noisy but still fairly primitive environment came Microsoft Visual InterDev. Microsoft wanted developers to take the web seriously, not as a playground for hobbyists, but as a genuine platform for enterprise applications. And in typical Redmond fashion, their solution wasn't subtle, it was a full-fat-eyed, packaged up with wizards, toolbars, and tight integration with the rest of the Microsoft world. Visual InterDev promised to make web development as easy as writing a Visual Basic form. In practice, well, let's just say the results were mixed. But for a few brief years, it was the face of Microsoft's web ambitions, and a tool that would shepherd many weary corporate developers into the unfamiliar world of web apps. Microsoft's late start on the web. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft had realized it was playing catch-up. Netscape had eaten its lunch on browsers, Sun was evangelizing Java, and open standards were creating a world where Windows was not the only option. Bill Gates famously issued the Internet tidal wave memo in 1995, warning that the company had to take the web seriously or risk irrelevance. Visual InterDev was part of the response. Microsoft already had Visual Studio for desktop and enterprise developers, but the web was still a wild frontier. What if you wanted to make something more sophisticated than static HTML? What if your intranet needed to query the company's SQL server? What if you wanted something more than hand-editing scripts in Notepad? That's where Visual InterDev came in. It was supposed to be the Visual Basic of the web, a tool to lure armies of corporate developers away from green screens and into this exciting, browser-based future. First impressions. At first glance, Visual InterDev looked reassuringly familiar. It had the same project trees, property sheets, and debugging windows you'd find in Visual C++ or Visual Basic. If you were already comfortable in the Microsoft ecosystem, you could slide into InterDev without too much culture shock. The IDE was a curious blend of design and code. On one side, you had a WYSIWYG editor, where you could drag and drop text boxes, tables, and images onto a web page canvas. On the other, you had code windows filled with a messy tangle of HTML, ASP tags, and either VBScript or JavaScript. Switching between the two views was often an exercise in disappointment. What looked neat in the design window would collapse into a rat's nest of code in the source view. But this was the late 1990s, messy HTML was practically a badge of honor. The power of ASP. The beating heart of Visual InterDev was active server pages, ASP. Before ASP, dynamic websites were often stitched together with Common Gateway Interface, CGI, scripts written in Perl, a powerful but fiddly approach. ASP simplified things. You could sprinkle little nuggets of server-side logic directly into your HTML, mixing and matching static content with dynamic responses. Visual InterDev made working with ASP much easier. You could insert ASP objects, debug them, and test them against a local IIS installation without leaving the IDE. For developers who had never touched Perl, this was a revelation. It turned the web from a collection of static pages into something interactive and alive. Suddenly, corporate intranets could display live sales data, customer records, or stock inventories, all without leaving the cozy embrace of Microsoft's world. Databases, glorious databases. If there was one feature Microsoft really wanted to shout about, it was database connectivity. InterDev came with wizards that could walk you through connecting to SQL Server, building queries, and binding results to your web pages. In theory, you didn't need to know a line of SQL to create a data-driven website. For IT departments, this was gold. Imagine, your accounts team wanted a dashboard to pull figures from the finance database. With Visual InterDev, you could whip one up in a fraction of the time it would take to build a full-fat client/server application. And because it all ran in a browser, distribution was trivial. No more sneaking around the office with floppy disks to install the latest version. Of course, in practice, things weren't always so smooth. The wizards could only take you so far, and sooner or later you had to grapple with SQL yourself. But compared to hand-rolling ODBC calls or writing pages of script, InterDev made the process approachable, if not elegant. Debugging in the late 90s. Anyone who's ever debugged client-side JavaScript in Netscape Navigator knows the meaning of pain. Error messages were cryptic, tools were non-existent, and you spent far too long staring at a blank screen wondering why nothing worked. Visual InterDev, however, gave you something approaching modern debugging for server-side ASP. You could set breakpoints, step through code, and inspect variables as the page executed. This was nothing short of miraculous at the time, and it gave developers confidence that their applications might actually work once deployed. The catch. For all its strengths, Visual InterDev came with strings attached. And by strings, we mean steel cables bolted firmly to the Microsoft ecosystem. You needed IIS to run your ASP applications. You were heavily encouraged to use SQL Server for your data. You were expected to run it all on Windows NT Server. For businesses already in Microsoft's orbit, this was fine, even welcome. For those who valued flexibility, standards compliance, or cross-platform capability, it was suffocating. Visual InterDev wasn't a tool for the open web, it was a tool for the Microsoft web. The competition. It's worth remembering that Visual InterDev didn't exist in a vacuum. Other tools were making waves at the same time. Macromedia Dreamweaver wooed designers with its slick interface and clean HTML output. Alec ColdFusion impressed developers with its straightforward, tag-based scripting language. Netscape Livewire tried to make server-side JavaScript a thing, though it never really caught on. Against these, Visual InterDev looked decidedly corporate. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't particularly standards-friendly. But it offered something the others didn't: tight integration with the tools, servers, and databases many companies were already paying for. If Dreamweaver was the cool, artistic cousin, Visual InterDev was the dependable, slightly boring uncle who turned up on time and brought spreadsheets. Life with InterDev. Ask anyone who actually used Visual InterDev in anger, and you'll get a mixed bag of memories. Some will tell you it was a lifesaver, the first time they felt they could build a real application for the web. Others will roll their eyes and recall hours spent wrestling with crashes, sluggish performance, and generated HTML so bloated it could sink a modem connection. The IDE could be temperamental. Projects grew unwieldy. And while the WYSIWYG editor looked good in demos, most serious developers quickly abandoned it in favor of hand coding. Still, it was better than cobbling everything together in Notepad, and it gave developers a feeling, however fleeting, that the web could be tamed. Short shelf life. Visual InterDev never really had a long run. By the early 2000s, Microsoft was shifting its attention to ASP.NET, a much more structured and powerful framework that addressed many of ASP's shortcomings. Visual InterDev was gradually folded into Visual Studio proper, and eventually disappeared as a standalone product. It didn't help that the web itself was evolving faster than the tool could keep up. Standards were maturing, browsers were improving, and developers were becoming more sophisticated. The clunky, proprietary nature of Visual InterDev made it look old-fashioned before it had even blown out its third birthday candles. Legacy. So what did Visual InterDev actually achieve? It introduced thousands of corporate developers to the idea that the web wasn't just for static pages and animated GIFs, it could run serious applications. It demonstrated the value of integrated IDEs for web development, a model that tools like Eclipse, Visual Studio.net, and later Visual Studio Code would refine. It brought database-driven web apps into the mainstream, long before the rise of frameworks like PHP/MySQL or Ruby on Rails. In short, it was a bridge. It wasn't the destination, but it got people moving in the right direction. Looking back with 2020 eyes. Today, when developers spin up slick web apps with React, Docker, and serverless backends, it's easy to scoff at Visual InterDev. Its clumsy wizards, bloated HTML, and reliance on IIS feel like relics from a prehistoric era. But in its own way, Visual InterDev was revolutionary. It took the chaos of early web development and tried, however imperfectly, to wrap it in a familiar, structured package. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't portable. But for the developers who used it, it was a first step into a bigger, browser-shaped world. Conclusion. Visual InterDev was never destined to be a legend. It lacked the charm of Dreamweaver, the staying power of Visual Basic, and the elegance of later frameworks. But for a few years, it mattered. It mattered to the companies who wanted to turn their databases into intranets. It mattered to the developers who needed a handhold on the slippery cliff face of web development. And it mattered to Microsoft, as part of its broader strategy to make the web run on Windows. If we judge it by longevity, Visual InterDev was a failure. If we judge it by influence, it was a success. It may not have built the modern web, but it paved the way for the tools that did. And that, in its own clunky, crash-prone, wizard-driven way, is worth remembering.